Part 3, the main stages of the war and the key battles and memories from the war. Um, Roughly speaking, most historians would subdivide the history of the 1948 war into three phases. The first stage was often referred to as the Civil War. It started as soon as November 1947 and continued into March 1948, or sometimes it will be extended into May 1948, the Declaration of Independence of Israel. And these divisions are subdivided, the phases are subdivided by the first and the second truces that are very critical moments, especially in cases when the nascent Israeli Defense Forces was able to rearm itself. And I would not go into details about the famous arms deal with Czechoslovakia that many would argue played a pivotal role and helped the new army to win in the battles. What are the key events that the national memories of both the Jewish Israelis and the Palestinians tend to refer to back time and again? So we've mentioned the fact that the November 29th vote was automatically seen as overshadowed by clouds of war, and soon enough you could see the beginning of hostilities. As far as Jerusalem is concerned, one of the most devastating events took place in February 22nd, 1948, in a terrorist car bombing at the very heart of downtown Jerusalem in Ben Yehuda Street. This is a pedestrian mall, and 3 British army trucks that were led by an armored car driven by Arab irregulars and British soldiers who were deserters. The convoy was passed through the English forces because the leading militant spoke fluent English. They did not suspect him, and the explosion was immense, and the effects were very severe. It took 36 hours to even go through the debris and the rebels and to find more than 140 wounded and 49 dead Jewish men and women. And it was at the very heart of a pedestrian district of the city, at the near a 4-story building that was a hotel called Atlantic was collapsed completely. The nearby Kupat Cholim, which is a medical center, and stores were ruined. So that was that loomed large in the memory of especially the Jerusalemites from that period. It was at the same time, or at least shortly thereafter, that the Haganah issued the very controversial Plan Daled, or Plan D. It was an operational military order that specified that in order to have a more cohesive defense system, the Haganah should target centers of Palestinian populations as part of a regional defense strategy. Now, it talked explicitly about the destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up, and planting mines in the debris, especially for those population centers which are difficult to control continuously. And the Haganah, soon to become the Israel Army, launched these military operations under the Plan Daled beginning in April 1948. I am mentioning Plan D not because our class is a history of military history. It's because today the plan is one of the key documents that historians like to disagree on. Some historians, many Palestinian historians, the very controversial Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, treat the document of Plan Dalet as a smoking gun, as a blueprint that shows that the Haganah already had a very clear idea of forcible depopulation and destruction of Palestinian civil centers. Others such as Benny Morris, Yoav Gelber, and others, refute that, and they're saying this is a defense mechanism and was not a plan of changing the demographic balance in Palestine, and the expulsion of Palestinians was taking place not under the auspices of Plan Dalet. I am not opening this can of worms in our discussion here, but I would like to pay that you will pay attention to the fact that this is one of the examples where the same document is interpreted in different ways to this day, and is very controversial and in that respect. The first phase also included other very important operations, such as Operation Nachshon and a famous battle over Kibbutz Mishomar HaEmek in the northern part of today's Israel, where the Arab Liberation Army, led by a charismatic officer by the name of Kaugji, was defeated in trying to attack a kibbutz, and the defenders fought back very bravely. The Mishmar HaEmek battle became canonized, and this is one of the sites where you can go and visit in Israel today. But a very different effect was left by two other brutal and critical events, and these are the Deir Yassin massacre and the Hadassah medical convoy massacres in the outskirts of Jerusalem. So what is the Deir Yassin massacre? Well, the basic atrocious basic facts are well known. On the morning of April 9th, 1948, this is 5 months after the beginning of the civil war in Palestine, but more than a month before the end of the British mandate, when British forces were still present, a combined force of 130 Jewish fighters associated with the Etzel and the Lehi attacked the village called Deir Yassin. It had about 600 residents. It was located 5 kilometers or 3 miles west of Jerusalem. Now, although battles to break the siege on Jerusalem were already taking place at nearby villages, this attack came as a surprise because a few months earlier, representatives of the Jewish Agency's political department signed a non-belligerency agreement with the leaders of several villages in the area, Deir Yassin included. After a few hours of door-to-door fighting, the village was conquered. Around 110 Palestinians, Arabs were killed during that morning, a great majority of whom were probably non-combatant civilians residents. And the remaining survivors, a mix of militiamen and unarmed civilians, were rounded up and expelled to the Arab-held eastern parts of Jerusalem, not before it was an impromptu victory parade that was organized, consisting of open trucks showing the so-called prisoners that drove through the streets of Western Jewish Jerusalem. Now, part of what happened was that rumors started playing a very important role, not only after the war, but in the time of the war. Shortly after reports about the battle emerged, you already had news about cases of mutilation and rape emerged, and the news were a mix of true facts, rumors, and exaggerations, but they spread panic throughout the country and instantaneously changed the dynamic of the war. And for that reason, most historians would agree today, Deir Yassin not only signified that the war entered a very dirty gloves off stage, but also initiated the mass exodus of Palestinians that were terrified by the stories about Jewish brutality, and they were leaving their villages fearing they will be the next Deir Yassin. So you can see how exaggerated rumors alongside true stories played an important role. They have contributed to the fact Palestinians started fleeing their villages. This was something that the leaders of the Jewish Agency, then David Ben-Gurion included, understood very well. And so in a sense, they also almost had an interest not to falsify these exaggerated rumors, but it was also, of course, a fuel for the propaganda. And as you can see from the image here, for instance, this Egyptian commemoration stamp issued in 1965, Deir Yassin became sort of the symbol of Zionist brutality and inhumanity. In the 70 years that passed, the ghost of Deir Yassin still haunt Israeli society. It's very important to mention that it was for Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionists, the fact that the attack on Deir Yassin was committed by the paramilitary forces associated with the revisionist movement, the Etzel and the Lehi, the Stern Gang, was important. They was presenting them as irregular militia that are not obeying orders, and in a sense could blame them for the atrocities. So part of the reason that it was also not hidden, it was the fact that it was easy to show that the Haganah are not playing a dirty war, and it's only the radicals of the right, which is, of course, a bit of a stretch, but we will not go into that. It was also a site that is very problematic. Unlike many other Arab villages that were deserted and then populated by Jews that were resettled in the empty houses. No such thing happened on the site of Deir Yassin, and today it's a medical facility, actually a mental hospital, which for many people is a hideous metaphors that to the atrocities that took place in that site, and what Israelis will call today Kiryat Shaul. Not too far away from Deir Yassin, very few days later, on April 13, the Jews felt that the Arabs were equally brutal when the Hadassah Convoy massacre took place. What was exactly the Hadassah Convoy? Hadassah was the name of the hospital in Mount Scopus. And the convoy that was escorted by the Haganah brought medical and military supplies and personnel to that hospital. And near the hospital was also the site of Mount Scopus campus of the Hebrew University. So there were also faculty, professors that were part of that convoy that was going into the besieged mountain. It was ambushed by Arab forces, and 78 Jewish doctors, nurses, students, patients, faculty members, and Haganah fighters were killed. One British soldier was also killed in the attack. The Jewish Agency was outraged when they understood that the British forces saw the attack and did not prevent it. Dozens of unidentified bodies burned beyond recognition were buried in a mass grave in the Sanhedria cemetery in Jerusalem. And the Jewish Agency claimed that the massacre was a gross violation of international humanitarian law, demanded action to be taken against the breach of the Geneva Convention, and of course, no such thing happened. So you can see that already by mid-April, both sides, the Jews and the Arabs, feel that the war is total. There's no distinguishing between civilian population and the military forces, and that one cannot trust the British to establish law and order. Very few days afterwards, the Battle of Haifa took place. And the fact it was called by the Jewish forces Operation Bi'ur Chametz, which literally means Passover cleaning, was something that was remembered and mentioned many times. And why is that? Haifa was, of course, a mixed city where Jews, Muslims, and Christian Arabs lived side by side. And the British withdrawal was completed from that city on the sunset of Tuesday, April 20th. They controlled only the port of Haifa during the time the battle took place, and the battle started the next day. Estimates of the number of Arab kills vary. Some Jewish sources put it around the number of 300. But the battle is remembered primarily because the Haganah did not target only Arab irregular forces. Actually, they were cut off from the main city at the very early stage of the battle with the conquest of the Rosh Maya Bridge. You can see in the slide before you. And very quickly on, they targeted the civilian population. In fact, the Karmeli Brigade's full force was unleashed on the local population, and when the Haganah command learned that the Arab authorities were calling upon civilians to gather for shelter in the old Arab marketplace, they started shooting mortars according to the official history of the Karmeli Brigade, that they were ordered to shell the marketplace. The psychological effects of such a shooting was enormous, and historians like Benny Morris describe how throughout the battle, Haganah was made very effective use of sort of psychological warfare techniques, including using Arab language broadcasts and loudspeaker vans that ran through the city, announcing that the day of judgment had arrived. And the orders for the Karmeli battalion was explicitly to kill every adult male Arab they encounter and to set alight firebombs to spread panic. The Arab National Committee of Haifa feared that they will face a merciless massacre. They did not formally surrender, but did turn to the British and requested evacuation of Haifa's Arab citizens. And the fact that the demographic balance of the city changed radically became one of the yet another scar in the history of the war, and we will return to Haifa when we will talk about Wadi Nisnas in sessions in the future. At the same time, Jerusalem was also a site of clash. Operation Kilshon means pitchfork in Hebrew, taking place in May 1948, was an important transition point. This is when the Jewish forces from the Haganah collaborated with the Irgun. It's an exceptional case. And the aims of the operation was to capture the Jewish suburbs of Jerusalem, particularly Talbiya, but also to take over the British installations in Jerusalem that were abandoned by the British who were leaving Palestine. And they had to try to do all these things together and then connect these isolated Jewish communities of southern Jerusalem and capture the heart of the city. Now, at the heart of the city of Jerusalem at the time was fortified. The entire center had rows of barbed wire, as you can see in these photos on the Jewish side. It made it very difficult for the forces to accept. These are the time that the heart of Jerusalem was nicknamed Bevingrad, meaning derived from the name of Ernst Bevin, the labor politician who was the British prime minister, and combining it with Stalingrad. So the British were fortifying these areas that include the Russian compound, which the British had that had as a police headquarters, which is a police station today, very close to where the Jerusalem municipality building is located today. The central post office. So this is the very heart of the administrative heart of Jerusalem. So the major battle took the central area, but there were clashes around near the old city at the area of the Notre Dame monastery that was first captured by the Lehi, but then retaken by Arab forces and then retaken once again. As you may, of course, remember, the old city of Jerusalem was in the hands of the Arab Legion. So this phase also includes, of course, a pan-Arab invasion of many forces that are entering into Palestine from other areas in help and support. And it would be under these very dramatic events that the British will formally declare the end of the mandate, and a new state will be declared, the Declaration of Independence. So the event that is formally called the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel was because of the circumstances of the war not taking place in Jerusalem, but in Tel Aviv, that was not under siege. It started at 4 p.m. on Friday, a time that was chosen so that it would not breach the Sabbath, and it was broadcast live. It was the first transmission of the Israeli radio station Kol Israel, and the declaration also gave the new state a new name, Israel, not a Jewish state, not a Hebrew state. And according to the plan, 37 members of the Provisional State Council, Mo'etzet HaMedina Azmanim, were the ones to sign on the declaration. But because of the siege of Jerusalem, 12 members could not attend. 11 of them were trapped in besieged Jerusalem. One was abroad. So actually, the signs you can see on Megillat Atzmaut, the Declaration of Independence today, some of them were added later on. We will discuss in sections to come the importance of this foundational document and the way it was composed. We'll read Yoram Shachar's article on Jefferson Goes to the East, and also how even the name Israel was contested, and that many of these decisions were not taken easily. But I want to remind us all that so many of these foundational decisions, how to call the state, how to declare it independence, were taking place in these very, very dramatic conditions. So they were taken rapidly, almost literally under fire. And it is important because, crucially, for many years, the Declaration of Independence was treated as almost the unwritten constitution of Israel. So this is one of the legacies of that event, according, of course. And what is left is, of course, this famous photo. But actually, just because I'm a careful historian, I have to clarify. The famous photo we often use to describe this event was not really taken in that dramatic Friday in May 1948, but actually was taken 10 years later, during a ceremony of restaging of the famous declaration, and as one of the newspaper's reporters in Ma'ariv that was there to cover the event said, one can reenact a historical event, but one cannot restore the sense of excitement and the vibration of the historic act, especially when it comes to the players who embody heroic figures. So in a sense, 10 years later, Ben Gurion and all the other members were invited to play themselves again at the first anniversary celebrations of the new state of Israel. Often textbooks and movies, documentary movies, and posters will treat this photo as if it was taken in 1948, but that's not the exact historical accuracy. So independence taking place in Tel Aviv, while Jerusalem is besieged. And the attempts to crush the siege on Jerusalem were successful, but the attempts to conquer the old city of Jerusalem were unsuccessful. And as you can see from the map here, of course, Jerusalem comes out from the war as a divided city, divided between the east and the west. Moshe Dayan famously had to sign with Abdallah Attal the line of what was called Hakav Ha'ironi, the municipal, the urban line dividing between the Jordanian and the Israeli occupied areas, and this would be the reality in Jerusalem until 1967, with Jordanian and Israeli policemen looking side by side, one next to the other, until the 1967 war. We will talk about it in sessions to come. Moving now to the next phases, and I would like to focus especially on Operation Anfar and on the battles on Lida and Jerusalem. So why are these so important? Latrun is one of the battles that were canonized more than any other battle of the 1948 war in Israeli popular consciousness. So what is the event and why was it remembered? The battle itself took place, it was a week-long battle taking place between, that started in May 25th, 1948, and it had series of battles. Latrun itself, that was a police compound that was actually originally a British Tegart fort, was taken only in mid-July 1948. Why was it so important? This stronghold was exactly a halfway mark between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the coastal plain. And the Israel High Command had of course, to its disposal, some forces, the 7th Brigade, but part of what captured the attention of so many memories and later on novels was the fact that the 7th Brigade had also included some 140 immigrants, and many of them died in the battle. Now, they were also missing basic equipments, canteens and guns, and against the advice of the brigade's commander, Ben-Gurion insisted that the road to Jerusalem must be cleared by, no matter what the toll is. And after 24-hour delay, the battle commenced, and many paid with their lives for the first failed attacks on this police Tegart fort in Latrun. The very unprepared brigade was under heavy fire, 48 dead, 46 injured in the first clash. Among those who were wounded was even the future Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and even 6 were taken as prisoners. 8 among those who died were immigrants. Now, in the Israeli memory, often the Latrun was a symbol of, was described erroneously as the battle in which newcomers, immigrants who were just almost walking skeletons, people who almost lost their lives in the Holocaust and did not receive proper military training, were immediately thrown into the fire. This is a complete myth, but for some reason it was kept on resurfacing time and again. The Palmach and the Haganah commanders portray this as a failure in the Jewish leadership because they wanted to move away from using their own soldiers like sacrifices, and instead they have their property properly trained. So there's a bit of a myth, but the fact that this is historical inaccuracy did not prevent Israeli authors, including people like Oren's popular novel Latrun, to go back to these sides. Now, in Ben-Gurion's view, the battle was necessary. He believed that it saved Jerusalem. Military historians are questioning this. Both of these descriptions of what happened in the battle been laced with lies and myth, and each group had its own ideas about what happened. Anita Shapira showed very convincingly in the case of Ben-Gurion that he lies about the entire basis what happened in an attempt to make himself sound like a responsible military leader. And she emphasized that he believed that this battle, which was clearly an impossible mission doomed to fail, was actually a success. And there's an interesting case that Shapira brings of Mati Meged, the Palmach editor, wrote about the first-hand experience at Latrun, which were later proven false. However, he pointed out in his defense that he actually portrayed the internal truth of the war. So this is sort of an artistic a truth that was seen as truth. So testimonies were not always respected, or people had a very plastic way of understanding what a credible testimony means. It's not necessarily eyewitnesses, but not first-hand testimony. There's a lot of hearsay, and these are the component of mythologized myth and battles. So a lot of the things that people will hear coming and visiting Latrun today, which is a museum and a site where the Israeli armored brigades will receive their degrees. Sometimes it's facts, and sometimes these are the same myth. If you're interested, please read Anita Shapira's Myth and Identity, the Case of Latrun 1948 for more details. Nevertheless, part of what happens in the 1948 war is that the members of the Palmach, young men that received some training in the 1930s under the British, but not formal military training, found themselves suddenly in the role of generals, moving battalions into action. And one of the symbols of that war is, of course, someone I've already introduced, Igal Alon, who joined the Haganah in the 1930s and was one of Ord Wingate's pupils in his special night squads. And he was the commander of Operation Iftach to conquer the Galilee, Operation Dani in the central part of Israel, Yoav and Chorev in the Negev. And he commanded the troops and also in very controversial battles, including in Lydia, and the troops that were ordered to shell the Altalena vessel. Later on, as I've mentioned, he became a member of Knesset for Mapam and Minister of Labor and the architect of the Alon plan. So you can see here how the figures we've introduced in pre-stated Palestine suddenly play a very important role in the war. Operation Anfar in July 1948 is another very important battle that often is forgotten. Anfar was actually a shorthand name for Mivtza Anti-Farouk. Farouk was the name of the Egyptian king at the time, and the idea behind the military operation was to push back the Egyptian military that was reached all the way into to the line of contemporary Ashdod in southern Israel, and it was a very important battle in which here the Israeli army was facing a regular conventional army. The Givati Brigade had many obstacles and many failed battles at that in attempting to capture the Negev and the southern Judea bloc that will prevent them to reconnect with the Jordanian forces. It was an especially brutal front. Uri Avneri, a Lehi member that was a soldier in the Givati Brigade, later to become a very prominent peace activist in Israel, had a very famous memoir that was called Besdot Pleshet 1948, in the fields of the Philistines in 1948. He described his battles there. That was translated into English, strongly recommended. It was part of this larger campaign to broaden the road to Jerusalem, and that led also to the conquest of Lydia and Ramla, al-Ramle, as part of Operation Dani. I've recommended reading Ali Shavitz's article that was first published in the New Yorker, that later became a bestseller, that talked about Lydia and the attack on Lydia as a metaphor to the atrocities of the war. calling it famously the black box of Zionism. I strongly recommend also to read David Meyer's review, slightly refute of some of the arguments that Ari Shavit is making in his piece. David Myers, for those of you who are not familiar with the name, is a prominent UCLA historian, a very prolific researcher and author who recently became the president of the New Israeli Fund. So what is it exactly that led Ari Shavit to call Lydia the black box of Zionism? Famously in the piece, Ari Shavit wrote, "The truth is that Zionism could not bear the Arab city of Lydia. From the very beginning, there was a substantial contradiction between Zionism and Lydia. If Zionism was to exist, Lydia could not exist. If Lydia was to exist, Zionism could not exist," end of quote. So Ari Shavit's very dramatic portrayal of the battle becomes a sort of a metaphor of the incompatibility between Zionism and the idea of having a substantial non-Jewish population in Israel. So when the news about the Lydia battle reached the headquarters of operation, the military commander, then it's Yigal Allon, asked Ben-Gurion what exactly I should do with the Arab civilian population. Ben-Gurion waved his hand, and this waving of hand was interpreted by the commander as an order: deport them. Hours later, Yitzhak Rabin, the operations officer, issued a written order to the brigade he commanded, the Yiftach brigade: the inhabitants of Lydia must be expelled quickly without regard to age. And the cities were depopulated. These cities, importantly, were in the partition plans seen as part of the territories of the future Arab state, not the Jewish state. So this is one of the examples when there was a clear case in which even when the fighting ended, hostilities between the fighting forces ended with a clear Israeli victory, expulsion of civilian population continued. I'm rushing quickly into the last phases of the war that developed after the beating heart of contemporary Israel, the coastal plain, the central area, and the road to Jerusalem was secured more or less. The Israeli army continued to the northern and the southern front in Operation Haram and Operation Yoav and Ovda. And the Galilee was conquered by the IDF, and the northern front between Israel and Lebanon was more or less established the way we know it today. In those fights in the upper Galilee and the area that Israelis would refer today as Etzba HaGalil, the finger of the Galilee, many of small villages were depopulated. Residents fled into the areas of contemporary Lebanon, and these are of course symbols of return. Ikrit and Bil'am that you can see on the map before you were famously two of these famous sites. And in many of these depopulated villages, new kibbutzim were established. And it was part of the soul-searching process of Israelis, and especially many of the members of these kibbutzim, that they thought, how could we speak on the one hand about equality and socialism, and at the same time loot property, and this is part of the process that Israelis underwent, especially under the 1990s and so on. So if we reach a conclusion, we can see that 1948, that I call it a war of partition, was exactly a war that started as an attempt to secure the areas of the partition, though it definitely tweaked the partition line. The armistice agreement lines that was signed, that you can see at the end of the war, a series of agreements that were signed in 1949, are different from the map that was envisioned before the war ended. And of course, the scars of the Palestinian side had to do with the fact that it was associated more than anything else with the creation of the refugee problem. Now, history and historians that were going back and reading and retracing these scars played a very important role in the Israeli public discourse. And one of the key figures in that respect is the historian Benny Morris. Benny Morris was, in the early 1990s, often referred to as the representative of the new historians, or the revisionist historian. His book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, that was published using declassified document that he was then almost one of the first ones to see, was a landmark work. And it was a very methodologically rigorous study that used many state archives and military archives to show the way in which the refugee problem was created as part of the war. Now, often during the 1990s, and I remember it very clearly as a graduate student, people tended to confuse between the so-called new historians that were showing that the official traditional narratives about the war and what actually happened are not necessarily the same, and the term post-Zionism, which was seen as a criticism of the very basic tenets of the Zionist ideology and a call to change the character of Israel. Benny Morris was a new historian. He was never a post-Zionist, and Morris as a historian was one thing, and Morris as a public figure and an intellectual was another thing. And therefore, in addition to his recorded lecture, I would strongly recommend reading also his very controversial interview with Ari Shavit, Survival of the Fittest, that he gave to Haaretz in 2004. And Benny Morris, the historian, was never shying away from showing that during the war there were atrocities, there were very questionable methods that were used by both sides, and that there was an expulsion, even if not a blueprint and a pre-planned idea of depopulating Palestine. There were very many cases in which fleeing of civilian population was encouraged by the Israeli forces. But the fact he was showing this in the 1990s after the first Intifada was a part of a new sensibility and a part of a feeling of Israelis that they are now reaching a stage that they are willing to look at also part of the dark sides of that war. After the Second Intifada, at the wake of the Second Intifada, Benny Morris, as a public figure, as an intellectual, was far more displeased with the Palestinian Authority, was disappointed and disillusioned by the Oslo Accords, and he started not revising his own historical scholarship, but revising his attitudes as a public figure and an intellectual, thinking about the future of Israel and speaking about the depopulation and as something that had to be done, and too bad that it was not done fully. And in a sense, the moment in which the Israelis were starting to talk about these dark sides of the war. This moment that the new Israeli historians are willing to look at the mirror and also ask ask disturbing question is also the same time that in Europe people are looking at the wars in what was previously known as Yugoslavia, and a new term entered the academic lexicon, namely the term ethnic cleansing. Now, I am extremely careful when using this term. The historical moment, the mid-1990s, when historians like Benny Morris and other Israeli new historians are willing to look at the more darker sides of Israeli history, is a very interesting moment, not only locally, but it's also the moment in which a new term enters into the academic lexicon, namely the term ethnic cleansing. And the term ethnic cleansing entered in the context of the wars in what was previously known as Yugoslavia. Now, I'm extremely careful when using the term. So what ethnic cleansing mean? And I reproduced the definition on purpose to be accurate as possible. It's the systematic forced removal of ethnic or religious groups from a given territory by a more powerful ethnic group, often with the intent of making it ethnically homogeneous. Now, I am aware of the fact that these terms have a provocative sound, and that such concepts has long aroused profound opposition and fierce scholarly and ideological debate. Employing them one takes the risk of being accused of hyperbole, but I'm willing to take that risk if I'll be allowed to just highlight why I think it is important to use these terms to highlight the problematics of the historical framing of 1948 that leaves these questions untouched. So the term ethnic cleansing should not be equated with annihilation nor with genocide. And most of the debates tend to equate these terms and see them as synonymous, and this is the source of the mistake. The term ethnic cleansing never meant an attempt to extinguish and extinct another population, an attempt to push an ethnic group to extinction, or what the famous Jewish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, that coined the term genocide, defined as acts of extermination. Ethnic cleansing is not about acts of extermination. It's about a territory-centric term that is rather referring to the policies and the practices of forcibly expelling one group, often by terror, less frequently by massacres, from a specific territory claimed by the state. So again, it entered into circulation around 1992, the same time that Benny Morris was writing, following the Serbian attacks on Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it originated, if you like, in the post-Holocaust writings of people like Raphael Lemkin and others, but as historians, including a very famous historian, Norman Naimer, called others like Yifat Weiss, after him, remind us, it's a crucial term for anyone who wishes to understand the dark side of independence. And in that respect, the dark side of Israeli independence should be treated by us as well, and it should be also understood in a more global context. If we see the world after World War II, it's a world in which ethnic cleansing and forced depopulation practices are the name of the game. So we can, if we start taking these terms seriously, we can start also moving beyond exceptionalism. We can locate the Nakba in a global perspective, see it as part of forced uprooting and resettling policies that were taking place throughout the post-World War II war. Of course, German populations in the Baltic regions, as you can see from the photo here of the Sudeten Germans in the future Czech Republic, were not politely asked to resettle. They were forcibly moved to other areas. And actually, the numbers you can see in post-war Europe are staggering. We can talk about approximately between 10 to 13 million civilians that were expelled or displaced. Not many of them did not reach the new destinations alive. These included Baltic Germans that were displaced by Hitler's and Stalin's negotiations already in 1939. The Volga Germans, Dutch Germans, and also from the areas of the Danube and Transylvania. And there's part of a kind of a reimagining of the world. Now, I am using this perspective not just to make a historical case, but I'm also to show you some of the new voices that appear in Israel, and following the footsteps of a leading historian in Israel today, Yifat Weiss. We will hear her lecture on Wadi Salib and Haifa's lost heritage, but I would like to emphasize that Yifat Weiss is a historian of Central Europe and a native of Haifa. So in a sense, her own biography in a way brings together the two strands I've just I've introduced. She is a daughter of the former member of Knesset, Shevach Weiss, an Israeli politician, was a Holocaust survivor and the president of the Yad Vashem Council. So Holocaust is very close to her personal family background and her research, and her biography, like her researcher, brought to see these connection. And in a very important article that I would recommend reading, entitled "Ethnic Cleansing, Memory and Property," she made an attempt to locate the Nakba of 1948 in a global perspective. See it as part of the forced uprooting and resettling policies that were taking place throughout World War II. Here's a short excerpt before you. The period from 1944 to 1948 is situated at a unique juncture in history in which the continuation of ethnic cleansing undertaken by Nazi Germany, as well as the Soviet Union, coincided with Allied planning of Europe's future shape following Germany's defeat. In contrast, the year 1948 not only inaugurates the Cold War, but also strips the practice of ethnic cleansing of all legitimacy in the European space. The events of 1948 in the Israeli-Palestinian space thus took place at a very point where World War II and the Holocaust met the Cold War. That is, in the same narrow window of opportunity during which ethnic cleansing was still internationally perceived as a legitimate method or necessarily evil. Ethnic cleansing operations in Central and Eastern Europe in the years in question were a direct outcome of agreements reached by the Allies at the 1948 Potsdam Conference concerning population exchanges. These exchanges were meant to empty Central Europe of its German minority, which was perceived as a fifth column that had welcomed and supported Nazi conquest. In fact, the Polish and Czech governments in exile took steps to foster such an arrangement from 1941 onwards. Ethnic cleansing operations, it must be remembered, were discussed at the initiative of exile governments of liberal and democratic nature, with support of democratic states, mainly Britain and the United States, were implemented in early post-war years in Poland and Czechoslovakia under the leadership of democratic parties. Ethnic cleansing operations thus should not be ascribed exclusively to the totalitarian tradition, even if the Nazi conquest and the Soviet control accelerated these projects. So in a sense, when we look at the Palestinian refugee problem and the way it was created, the global context looms large. regional and the local perspectives, nevertheless, are the ones that are leading the discussion, and they are at the heart of the way in which the term refugee is understood differently by Palestinians and Israel, and also the different ways in which international community dealt with this, and the role of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinians, in a way, many argued, perpetuated the condition of Palestinians as refugees. The refugee was not seen as a temporary category, but something that Palestinians stayed so quote unquote stuck in it, and this is a source of ongoing, very fierce political polemics. But it was at that time that also the leading Arab intellectuals started using the term Nakba to describe the events of 1948. The term was probably coined for the first time by Konstantin Zurayek, a leading Arab historian, exponent of a secular, liberal pan-Arabism. He was born in Damascus, to a Greek Orthodox family, and was educated at the American University in Beirut, and eventually received his PhD at Princeton University at a very young age, and was a very strong voice for the Palestinians for many years. Served as envoy in Washington D.C. 1946-7. And had been a delegate to the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council. And it was a term that for him symbolized more than simply the process of expulsion. When Zurayek was thinking about the Nakba, he was using it to not only material collapse, but as he called it, I quote, the collapse of values, which is shown in various ways. It's shown by the doubt of the Arabs in their governments and their accusations of their leaders and rulers, even by doubt of many of them in themselves and in their potentiality as a nation. It is also shown by the despair in their breast, by their refusal to meet with the danger, and by their shrinking before the magnitude of the blow. Indeed, this moral and spiritual relapse is more important than the material loss. Spiritual relapse, no matter how great the latter might be, for it is resolution of a people crumbles and in confidence in itself lost, it loses the best that it possesses and is impotent to rise after a fall or to shake from itself the dust of humiliation and defeat, end quote. So you can see that when Zurayek was thinking about the meaning of disaster, the meaning of Nakba, as he called it, this text was written in Arabic and translated into English, much more than the loss of physical property of land and values. Nakba was a collapse of moral values, a sense of self-esteem. And therefore, from 1948 on, this term became such a central element in the reimagining of what an Palestinian national identity is. We conclude this part, and we will move right into part 4, memory activism.